Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network 𝐂𝐦𝐤 Week in Review. I'm Asbet Bedrosyan, and along with 𝐺 Manucharyan, this week we're going to talk about the following major topics. Lost in Artsakh, thirsty in Syunik, amending the law on mass media, an update on the political scene in Yerevan, and rising debt, inflation, and interest rates. To talk about these issues, we have with us Emil Sanamyan, a senior research fellow at USC's Institute of Armenian Studies, specializing in politics in the Caucasus, with a special focus on Azerbaijan, and Hrant Mikhaelyan, a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He's also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. Hello and welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
All right. Since the ceasefire in November, the Pashinyan government's focus has been on defining and opening borders and initiating trade and economic relations with Azerbaijan. Critics are asking why the government is not doing more in holding Azerbaijan responsible for fulfilling its end of the deal. After 3 months, we're seeing Azerbaijan continue to push for gains on multiple fronts. It has not only not fulfilled its obligations in the all-for-all exchange of POWs, it has dubbed some of the POWs terrorists and claims that criminal charges will be filed against them. It has advanced its positions forward beyond the ceasefire line of contact. It has imposed restrictions on the collection of the remains of Armenian soldiers from the front lines. It continues to divert water resources flowing through Nakhichevan so that it doesn't reach Syunik, etc. Emil, how do you view the current situation, and do you see a need for the current dynamic to change?
Well, the current situation continues to flow from November 9 surrender by Nikol Pashinyan on behalf of the rest of the Armenians. Everything that's transpired since then is sort of a continuation of that. Nikol Pashinyan obliging both Aliyev and Putin, fulfilling the obligations he made, and unable to convince the others to fulfill obligations they made, because he's the weak part of this equation. He's the one carrying water for everybody. The approach has been not to antagonize Aliyev in any way or shape or form, so if Armenians are told to vacate houses or vacate territory, they do that. Government in Yerevan tells them to suck it up, and that's about it. There's hope that in exchange for, at this point, maybe largely symbolic moves like disbanding the defense army of Artsakh, not visiting Artsakh unnecessarily, etc.
But is that a reality, because it's been refuted by the authorities in Artsakh?
Yeah, there is a transformation happening in terms of the name of the organization. The bottom line is whether Armenia will continue to send soldiers into Artsakh,
right, or even armaments
to serve. Yeah. And it doesn't look like they'll be doing it, so at least not in the way that used to be done. So under that rubric, they might release more prisoners, hostages that they're holding, and that'd be qualified as a success for the government.
Hrant, what do you think?
Well, generally, I think situation stayed stable during last several months and is not going to stabilize soon. This is regard to internal situation in Armenia. Concerning the negotiations with Azerbaijan and so on, I think Armenia at this time has restrained and is expecting to see whatever will be done from Russian side. So it's like Armenia has washed its hands. This is situation as of this time.
So despite a deep distrust and reservations by the Armenian people, pro-government circles continue to extol the virtues of living in peace, open borders, and economic benefits, trading with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Hrant, how do you explain this disconnect between the people and the government?
I think it's not even between the people and the government. It's more between the government and the reality, because this government is struggling to stay in power. It's afraid of being persuaded, and it has good reasons to be afraid, so it will do whatever it takes to avoid it. And in terms to avoid it, it will try to turn over whole narrative on the war, on Azerbaijan, on Armenia, on Armenia's national interests, and so on. They will do whatever it takes to stay in power. So at this time, it's as simple as that. And that's why the words that we hear are not the way to describe the reality. They are a mean to create the reality. If we look at it this way, I think it will be more understandable of what is going on currently.
What do you think about the remake of the Artsakh Defense Forces?
I think it is a very problematic point, because if the Artsakh Defense Forces will not be attached to Armenia at all, So if it will be effectively dependent on Russia, I think it will be very hard to keep Armenian presence in Artsakh. And we see very many signs of Russian influence growing in Artsakh, which is understandable because Russia is a peacekeeper there. But it's also very important, it's crucial to keep Armenian presence there. But as of now, Armenian authorities are okay with losing control over Artsakh. And this is, I think, also part of this big story. Because the more government would speak about Artsakh, about problems, about needs of people. They have one of the ministers said that there are no social issues in Artsakh as of now. No social issues.
Right.
So they are trying to pull out Artsakh and the whole security, national interest, Artsakh discourse out of political field and to live like it was before the war. Let's say, imagine like nothing happened. The problem is that even if Armenia imagines that nothing happened, it's not that Azerbaijan will follow it.
I wanted to ask if any of you were aware of the veracity of only Armenian citizens can now use the Lachin corridor to enter Artsakh. Have you heard anything new on that front?
Well, there was some unofficial information on that lately, connected to French journalists and politicians who wanted to enter Artsakh, and we learned that it's not possible for them, and this raises many questions, because if there is any passport regime, I think it should be clear what kind of regime it is, while if there is some informal regulations which might change over time, this means that there is a very ambiguous situation from point of view of law. One day we might know that Armenian citizens are also not allowed to enter, because Azerbaijan has made several signs that it does not want to see Armenian citizens there. So I think it's also dependent on Armenia. Should set its agenda that people can enter from Armenia to Artsakh, including people of different nationalities. And I think it's on Armenian side to push for that regulation.
Yeah, Hrant mentioned that Azerbaijan is not behaving like nothing has happened. And in fact, they're behaving like an absolute winner in this. And part of the distrust comes from this explicit and unabashed hate towards Armenians that Erdogan and Aliyev have promoted over the years, and they're now acting on that. For example, the heroization of Ramil Safarov. Emil, you had an interesting article on the USC Armenian Institute's website past week about Azerbaijan's policy of promoting individuals who commit heinous crimes. Can you talk more about this? And is it just a coincidence, or is it part of actually an official policy, in your opinion?
I think it was an interesting development that most people missed because so many other things have happened in Armenia and Azerbaijan. But this individual by the name of Ibad Huseynov awarded the National Hero title of Azerbaijan on December 9, together with all the other awards that were given for the war. What's interesting about Ibad Huseynov, he's a veteran of the First War, and he's best known for this picture that circulated about 15-20 years ago of him sitting next to a head of a person, obviously severed from the body, and he claimed that was the head of Monte Melkonyan. Of course, Monte Melkonyan died under different circumstances. His head stayed on his shoulders when he was being buried, etc. But people don't care about details like that. So at one point, the officials in Azerbaijan were promoting this notion that this hero of the war, this little-known hero, took revenge on Monte Melkonyan and all those things. Even in Azerbaijan itself, other participants of the war contradicted that and said that this was a totally bogus story, that this is just government propaganda. A brother of this Ibad Huseynov was actually a government official. But the story got sipped through into Turkey as well, and I've looked through just last week, and there are at least 3 or 4 pictures that come up immediately of Ibad Huseynov meeting with Erdogan. So this notion that this Azerbaijani quote-unquote hero took revenge for also the Turkish victims of Monte Melkonyan, I think was something that Erdogan appreciated in some way. For some years now, there was information that Ibad Huseynov was lobbying to become a national hero of Azerbaijan, to get that title, and he was given that title. And it's a very peculiar development because only 3 or 4, maybe 5 individuals who are alive today have that national hero title. Most national hero titles are given to people who have died. So this is a significant recognition in Azerbaijani context, and the fact that it was given to a person best known for a war crime and sort of this bogus story, even inside Azerbaijan, he has a pretty bad name. I thought it was significant because on one hand, it promoted this sort of behavior. On the other hand, I think it was a gesture to Erdogan because this Ibad Huseynov has become kind of a Erdogan fanboy.
Wow.
This is interesting. It sounds like it's a political game and propaganda.
Yeah, it's just, it looked like a gesture towards Erdogan because even in the Aliyev circle and within Azerbaijan, like I said, this person isn't really seen as having done anything heroic. He's not known to have done anything heroic other than take a picture with that head. It's not even clear if he cut it off. Yeah, and Erdogan, yeah.
All right, moving to our next topic. A few days ago, 6 My Step MPs announced a new bill to amend the law on mass media. They say it aims to differentiate between professional reporters and press organizations from unnamed sources. Basically, they define a source, quote-unquote, unnamed if the internet domain or website or channel's registered owner's information is hidden. And I think mostly they're referring to Telegram channels like Mediaport, Deja Vu, and things like that. This bill came around suddenly. There doesn't seem to have been much, if any, discussion in the parliament about it. Hrant, what do you make of this? Is this a genuine attempt to control fake news, or is the government feeling like it's unable to control the post-war news narrative?
I think if government really wanted to control spread of fake news, it had a lot of time for that. There are many channels which are complementary to this government. We don't know who are running them, but at least they are extremely complementary to this government. They disseminate fake news, they disseminate hate. Sometimes these channels were quoted by not only state media or government-friendly media, but also Prime Minister himself. Now, if this is not forbidden, if the law will work only one-sided, this is problematic. If really the new legislation will be aimed to prevent fake news spread, this is another story. But I don't believe that, because so much of fake news were spread by the government-friendly media that it's hard to believe that they are really trying to prevent fake news spread.
Hovik, does this bill encroach on journalists' ability to keep their sources anonymous? I mean, what are the problems that the ruling bloc is really trying to solve here? Because it certainly doesn't solve the issue of unidentified channels flooding the internet with material, right?
No, unfortunately not. I think that any attempt to legislate freedom of press or somehow take it away is fraught with a lot of problems. And I concur with Taran, because one of the problems with why people trust these alternative news sources is because there's so much chaos and there's so much distrust in the official line that, you know, people seek out alternative information. I not mention that the Prime Minister himself was involved in sharing information, for instance, from this outfit called Perfect TV, which is number 3 in terms of the most viewed YouTube channels in Armenia, or Armenian YouTube channels. I've been doing some unofficial measuring of this viewership through statistics and so forth, and by collecting viewership and tracking how it changes month to month. In the top 5 or 10 are channels that are either outright fake news.
Yeah, it's amazing how much actually viewership there is of those Perfect TV type channels on YouTube.
So, in terms of free speech, in my opinion, Armenia should refrain from controlling actually what can be done through law and instead increase the atmosphere of trust, and where consumers are able to trust what they're reading, and that should contribute more towards distrust of sources that are shady or anonymous in some way. So, to me, that's the main problem.
Hovik, you just want to sing Kumbaya, don't you? Let's just sing it together.
Well, when you talk about trust, let me just make a quick aside. Emil, during the war in Artsakh last year, there was a lot of confusing information coming from the Armenian government and its armed forces channels. So they actively discouraged us from looking up enemy channels or spreading quote-unquote unverified information. Yet in retrospect, we know that much of the official information was either propaganda or fake. Mm-hmm. And then, also in retrospect, it turned out that these so-called unnamed sources, which we were following both on Twitter, Telegram, whatever, had useful and correct information. You are an expert source and also consumer of such information everywhere. What are your thoughts about this issue?
Particularly in the war coverage, I was coming in with a heavy bias, with experience of Azerbaijan habitually exaggerating its gains and Armenian losses, etc. So knowing that my lens had been, I've given basically Armenian government more of a benefit of the doubt than I should have in at least the first couple of weeks of the war. After that, it became clear that the information just didn't match events on the ground roughly after October 10, 11. In a sense, that's just a war situation. War situation is a very difficult period to report objectively, no matter how much you want to objectively report. What has been clear to me even before this war situation, is that Nikol Pashinyan specifically is a big believer in power of information. He's a journalist for over 20 years, published negative stories about the government, and I'm sure he believes that that's what brought him to power. And frequently, negative stories were libelous or baseless. The Byzantine Yerevan politics sometimes are difficult to disentangle. Is this official really that corrupt, or is this official really that bad, etc.? But there were some reporting I remember from Nikol Pashinyan from early 2000s that were obviously wrong. For example, he claimed at the time that the Armenian government gave up some territories on the Tavush border, some villages that were captured during the war. And, I was able to double check that and with local sources, people who had local access, and it was clear. It was just totally made up story. So since then, I've had a big question mark as to credibility of Nikol Pashinyan, his newspaper, etc. So always took everything he reported with a grain of salt. But bottom line is, he believes in the power of information. He believes that he needs to quash negative stories about him and promote positive stories about him. So that's what you're seeing. And it could be in Telegram. It could be, remember a couple years ago, there were anonymous people on Facebook that wrote bad things about Pashinyan, and the KGB went and arrested him. So that was the case before the war. It will continue to be the case as long as he's in power.
Hovig, I know the whole issue of media literacy is very close to your heart. Back when we started this podcast series, it was at the end of June when we were initiating it. And at your initiation, we also had a segment that we were going to do every week on media literacy and the state of the media in Armenia, the laws, etc. Of course, you know the history, because on the same day that we released our first issue, the July war started, and we've gone from war to war, and we haven't had the time to deal with media literacy as currently as we would like it. It seems like the parliamentarians have not even consulted with any members of the press before advancing this bill. What do you think is going on here?
Yes, lest I be accused of singing Kumbaya again, let me state it clearly that I think that the actions of this government are the opposite of what Armenia needs in terms of improving media literacy. Yes, short of training people, short of informing people on how to pick sources, you need to have an alternative that you can trust. But here you're telling people, do not pick this source that has shady information, which actually most of the time is true. This Telegram channel that they're trying to control is true, and trust us when we have lied to you 100% during the entire war, and even afterwards, about what happened during the war. In fact, it's not just the official government lying. The government is, there's evidence that the government is either officially sponsoring these fake news channels, which is like Perfect TV, or it's obviously tolerating, because like Emil said, when they had a problem with some individual who posted, an individual, not a source, not a media outlet, just some unknown page, posted some information it didn't like about Iran, it went and arrested this person somehow. Yet all these other media channels on YouTube and so forth have free reign over what they can post, and frequently they post very hateful stuff. Frequently they post false information to glorify Nikol Pashinyan, and this is what needs to be stopped. Until then, people are going to continue to distrust the government and seek alternative media. And I'm tracking, as I said, all these sources of fake news. I would say about 35% of all views on YouTube are associated with these channels that are of completely unknown nature. And it's not because, some media is quoting them. Is YouTube is recommending these to people, and for whatever algorithm is doing that, and whatever sites that are linking to these are not the opposition sites. These are pro-government fake news media.
It comes back to how the landscape of the media is changing so radically that it's no longer the same as 20, 30, or even 10 years ago when people would just read the newspaper. The issue of media literacy is so radically important, of educating people to understand how to look up what they're looking up.
May I just add to that it's actually much worse than what it was 3 years ago. I distinctly believe that the actions of this government have led to a much worse situation than we had like 3 years ago even.
Yeah, I just would stress that point because Nikol Pashinyan is the first journalist to become leader of Armenia, and a political journalist and sort of attack journalist. So for him, that's the natural habitat where he, writes bad stories about his enemies and claims that he's doing good work. So even none of his predecessors were as personally invested in this sort of political reporting. And that's why you have even, reporters that were just working either with Nikol Pashinyan or with, RFERL or others actually preparing bills like this in parliament to try to control information because they believe that's very important, and that's how you win or lose.
Okay. So where would that leave us, the Armenian News Network GRUNG? Are we some unknown source, or are we a conscientious and fair organization?
Are you asking yourself or?
All of us.
I think a lot also depends on what the Armenian government wants to interpret. So they not only have this definition to go by, they also have the freedom to, by law enforcement, to interpret things. For instance, is the contact information or the owner's information publicly listed on our site? Elspeth, is your address on the 𝐤𝐚 website? So if not, then maybe it'll be interpreted incorrectly.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point because a lot of people do not register their names in the network registration publicly because they get spammed, they get undesirable contact. So I can sympathize with them. But okay, well, our information is well known. A lot of people know how to get in touch with us. We've been associated with every organization in the world. So I guess we've certified ourselves as a fair and conscientious organization. You can quote us on this. Okay, very good. Moving on. The Pashinyan team seems to be gearing up for snap elections in June. Last week, we also saw some developments in the opposition. The Homeland Salvation Movement's leaders have met, including former Presidents Serge Sargsyan and Robert Kocharyan. There are agreements and disagreements. Also, Sargsyan just met with the Russian ambassador, while Kocharyan is visiting Moscow to attend Sistema's board of directors meeting, but also reportedly to meet with some quote-unquote Russian elite. Hrant, how do you view these developments on the political scene?
Well, since a big portion of this information is based on inside, and sometimes it's confirmed, but again, not fully, it's very hard to assess it. Obviously, Russian influence in Armenia is big, and there is some perception of growing of Russian influence over the internal politics in Armenia. But again, it's very hard to assess what is going on in reality, because, okay, for example, Serge Sargsyan has met the Russian ambassador. Then Yerevan Petrosyan has also met him. What does that mean? What did they discuss? It's a bit hard to say because all these people are not inclined to speak much. It's not Nikol Pashinyan. At least somehow, indirectly, we could get some information from himself. Now here it's much difficult to assess. That's why I cannot say anything specific.
Emil? Under what circumstances could the Russians align with the opposition and drop the prime minister?
I'm not sure. I think we'll keep an eye on it, but I don't think at this point they are really concerned. First of all, it's not clear, and it's all in hands of Nikol Pashinyan, whether to call an early election or not. I am inclined to think that if he sees Kocharyan as a growing threat, he will not be inclined to call an early election. If KGB does polling and they assure him that there's no way Kocharyan is going to win an election, there's a big gap between him and Kocharyan, then he might go for an early election. Or I don't know, maybe he will go for an early election anyway. Nobody knows, and this thing can be unpredictable. What is clear is that it's between Nikol Pashinyan and Robert Kocharyan right now. And there are no other players that are of significance that I'm observing. And it's sort of a continuation of the Armenian tradition of former leaders coming and challenging their successors once removed, right? We had Demirchyan challenge Kocharyan, and we had Ter-Petrosyan challenge Serge Sargsyan, etc. So if this was happening without the war, I would have said Kocharyan had no chance because Nikol Pashinyan has shown his power in domestic politics in terms of manipulation, in terms of argumentation, etc.
Right, and all the baggage involved.
Yeah, but now we are in a situation where we have essentially Armenian statehood very much on the precipice, and it's not clear whether it's going to survive. And I think that makes Kocharyan actually a potent candidate, where is a person known for his strength and projecting strength that might resonate with a segment of the public that doesn't accept this reality. But I'm not sure how big that segment of the public is. The philosophical aspect of this that I've been kind of thinking about is, Nikol Pashinyan always appeals to the people of Armenia, the people's desires. He talks about, people's revenge against the state sort of thing. And it does kind of resonate in the sense that if you think about it, this 30 years or whatever of independent statehood has been very hard on most people in Armenia. So many people left Armenia, so many people have been dissatisfied with how the Armenian statehood is run. So logical sort of continuation of that is to get rid of the statehood and remerge and back into the Russian Empire or whatever, Russian Federation, whatever it might be. And that would be something that the majority of Armenian people want, rather than this national elites that have sort of found their niche in the Armenian statehood, where people like former presidents, former prime ministers, former ministers, they would never have been ministers or prime ministers if Armenia wasn't independent, right? So for this sort of people, yes, Armenian statehood makes sense. But for a lot of Armenian citizens or Armenian people, it doesn't. So this becomes kind of a battle between a stateless Armenian nation just wants to be happy, and this people who are trying to drag it into a statehood or keep it in statehood. So like Kocharian or I don't know, Ter-Petrosyan, etc. So we'll see where it goes, but it's clear it's about these two approaches. And of course, Nikol Pashinyan does not claim that he's against the Armenian state. He claims that he's for the Armenian people and for the Armenian state. But there seems to be this subconscious, almost distrust and hate for the state.
That's a depressing outlook. What will end up like a region of Russia, just like Kaliningrad?
No, not like Kaliningrad, more like North Ossetia or something.
Hovig, what are you thinking we're likely to see next?
Before that, I'd just like to address some of what Emil said. I don't think that over the past 30 years, things were as bad as a lot of people perceive. For instance, the Corruption Perception Index, or there's a huge gap between perceived corruption and actual corruption. I think that a lot of the negativity that people associate with the government has been engineered, to be honest. And part
Hovig,
of the
this whole, I'm sorry, but this whole talk about corruption is just baloney, okay? It's people don't mind corruption as long as they're benefiting from it.
No, but all I'm saying is that
problems.
Yeah, you were mentioning that people were dissatisfied about how things were run. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of that was with Nikol Pashinyan being in the opposition and being in control of some allied forces. So it's not just Nikol Pashinyan, but there's always a lot of incorrect perceptions than reality. There were some problems, but I don't think they were so bad compared to other states in the region.
There were many problems. I mean, I don't want to come across like we're completely minimizing it, because this corruption also at some level stopped a lot of diaspora investment, because a lot of diasporans who wanted to go do business had problems starting up, had problems continuing.
I'm sorry,
that's another bunch of excuses, because you have diasporans investing in all kinds of corrupt countries, working in all kinds of corrupt countries, Arab
Saudi
world,
Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, come on.
We do.
It's not about that.
True.
It's about the bottom line.
But there would have been more. There would have been more.
Let's just say that a lot of the negativity towards history and perception of history and perception of how things were in Armenia is incorrect, in my opinion. But you asked me what would take place next. I think that a lot of supporters of the opposition wanted to see the resignation of the prime minister, but I do not see that happening, in my opinion. So far, I think the Republican Party has been the only one who has categorically rejected cooperating with Nikol Pashinyan on new elections. Everyone else has, in one way or the other, skirted that issue or has expressed readiness to participate in elections. For instance, Kocharian in his last interview did that. Unfortunately, I think that either there will be no elections and Pashinyan will serve out his term, or there will be snap elections in June. I think that's when the Pashinyan government is trying to target that, either early June or late June.
Yeah, that's right. When I was talking at the start about disagreements between the opposition, it was on the issue of whether they would participate or not participate in those snap elections. Mostly they seem to be interested in participating, but I think that the Republican Party and Serge Sargsyan were the ones who were not who were opposed to opposition participating in
and
those
maybe the
elections.
ARF in one way or the other, but the most categorical rejection of cooperation with Pashinyan was by the ＨHK, or the Republican Party, and a lot has changed since that rejection. So that was around end of December. Now with Kocharian openly saying that if the elections are held, then he will participate. And even Seyran Ohanyan recently in an interview said that he will participate, although he didn't name any candidate or any party that he would support. I think maybe once the Republicans see there's no chance of avoiding the elections, they will also change their tune. I think what will be interesting to see, since we're talking about Kocharian, but I'm not seeing the vehicle through which Kocharian plans to enter politics yet. So whether it's a political
I think the vehicle
party,
is clear. Vehicle is clear. It's the Republican Party. It's the Dashnak Party. It's the 𝐵𝐴 Party. I mean, what else? It's not like he can invent a party. Of course, at the grassroots level, if we could say that, the local, regional level, those are the organizations. When he was president and he was running for re-election, that's how he was running, right? All these parties organized the voters for him. Dashnaks, first of all, Republicans. Number two were supporters Dashnaks, and the 𝐵𝐴 was originally actually the party that he had a role in setting up. Tsarukyan was a friend of his brother, Robert Kocharian's brother. So I think that's the direction. It's not clear if they're going to have enough support. That's the big question. What's clear is that he's going to be the main challenger. Whether Russia weighs in, Putin weighs in on one side or another is also not clear, because Kocharian is going to be a more difficult person to deal with for the Russians, right? Or anybody. he's going to demand things. He's going to push for things. Even sitting in prison, he doesn't beg. So if he becomes president, obviously he's going to try to improve this balance of forces between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Armenia and Russia as well. And, creates additional issues. I'm not sure Putin really wants that at this point. The whole relationship between Putin and Ǩoçaryan is very interesting. You almost hear Putin talk about Ǩoçaryan more than Ǩoçaryan talk about Putin. I think that reflects their personalities. Ǩoçaryan being kind of an older brother in that relationship, in terms of...
I think they're pretty much the same age. They're 66, 67.
In terms of the fact that Ǩoçaryan became president before Putin became president, right? So if we look at how that relationship sort of got kindled back in the late 90s, Ǩoçaryan became president in 1998, and this was a period of sort of transition in Russia. Putin was still kind of a nobody at the time. He was, I think, maybe head of the FSB at some point. But there was a big battle in Russia between sort of the oligarchic side of Russian political scene, led by Boris Berezovsky, and the statist, eventually led by Putin. I think what Putin was most impressed by at the time is that Berezovsky was sort of trying to coordinate Russian policy everywhere, including in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. So he came to Armenia and demanded that Armenia agree, I forget what it was exactly, but something along the lines of territorial integrity of Azerbaijan and all CIS states. There was some kind of discussion like that, and Ǩoçaryan sent them packing and just told them, you're nobody, I'm not going to accept your demands. And I think that's where Putin's first impression of Ǩoçaryan comes from, that he was able to say no to a person that was at the time considered sort of the most powerful person in Russia, because Yeltsin was very much on the outs in terms of his physical conditions. So that's where the relationship comes from. But that doesn't mean that today Putin would necessarily want Ǩoçaryan as a counterpart.
Hrant, do you have any final thoughts on this issue?
I had a minor issue. Well, first of all, I want to agree with all what has been said, and I think what Emil and Hovik were speaking does not contradict to each other. So it's really that Armenian society is not able, at least as of now, to understand the value of state, and the elites were not able to adequately to describe this to the population, and that the economic troubles which Armenia faced have started since 1992. So in public mind, it is connected to the independence. Although Russia and other countries also had these economic troubles, but in Armenia, people connected to the independence. Concerning Ǩoçaryan issue, I think he might overestimate his popularity as of now. Yes, there is some growing demand of him, but it's not clear how big it is. I think we need more open data and polls to understand what is the situation in public opinion. And also concerning Pashinyan, his approval rate is also unclear. From the data we see it is about 40%, but there are some factors which affect approval rates which we might be able to measure. So as of now, the situation in Armenian internal politics is very unclear. Concerning Republicans, from what I know, Republicans have very firm decisions that they will not participate in any kind of political process initiated by Pashinyan, and this information is also pretty recent, so they did not change their decision as of now. And I think they will not change because they consider Pashinyan not only to be guilty for what happened in Artsakh, but also to be not reliable partner in any political process.
All right. Hrant, the Armenian economy shrank about 7.8 or 8% last year, and currently the data shows that there's a 6.4% year-over-year inflation. The central bank has increased the interest rates twice to keep this inflation down, and the unemployment rate, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, around 16%. The government is currently projecting a 3.2% growth in 2021. Quick question. Is this a realistic assessment of the coming year?
Well, 3.2% is possible to achieve. It depends also on the global economic health and on the situation with the pandemic. And given the low base effect, which we have as of now, because in 2020 the economy has dropped down by almost 8%, as you said, theoretically we could achieve 3% growth. But it's very hard to predict anything as of now, because situation is very unstable. From December data, I've seen several signs, minor signs, that theoretically economy could start recovering at low rate, but again, I think that this year we will have some growth.
Just this past week, there were a couple of additions to the national debt. which is now standing around $9 billion. I think they obtained a $7.5 million loan from the World Bank to complete some hospital projects they started in 2013. But more significantly, there was a Eurobond issue of Armenia for $750 million. Some of it is going to be servicing the current debt, but we have no idea about what else they're planning to spend that money on. Do you have any guesses?
Well, this year I think we will have about $700 to $800 million budget deficit. So if nothing changes, this money will be just used to cover the budget deficit, which also includes payment on older debts. But generally they are trying to keep as big budget expenses as possible. It also might be that they don't expect to be in the power as long as it will start becoming a problem, because if you get the debt now, you will pay it, 10, 20 years later. So now they will use the money and then the problem will occur much later. So I think they are trying to keep as big social expenses as possible. There were also rumors that the government tries to increase pensions and some other social benefits in order to keep the approval rate high.
All right. There's always so much to talk about, but for now, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That concludes our program for this Week in Review episode. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from the previous week. We look forward to your feedback and your suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at grung.org or on our Facebook page, ANN-Grung, or in our Facebook group, Grung-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.